Let's compare the 6 melee damage dealers of Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail. If you already know you want to main a melee DPS, then this might serve to help you choose, or alternatively teach you what you don't want. Or maybe you just want to hear about the pros and cons of each of these jobs, combined with a bit of comedy, in which case you have also come to the right place. Please take note that this video of course includes my opinion at times, especially in some of the ratings shown for each job. So, if you feel that I missed something or that you disagree, I would love to hear about it or about your favorite melee DPS in the comments. Now then, let's start with the literal melee job, the Monk. The first of the striking category, combining punches and kicking martial arts with chakra and fantasy monk aesthetics. The Monk has very few surprises in its toolkit. The basics of the Monk rotation revolves around its 3 forms: Oppo Oppo, a type of monkey, Raptor, a bird-like raptor creature, and Quirl, an electric feline creature. And one form leads to the next, giving rise to 1-2-3 combos like most melee jobs. However, Monk can freely choose between any of its 3 step 1s, then any of its step 2s, then any of its finishing step 3s as it pleases, unlike other jobs. However, by the way the Monk's Fury gauge functions, this tends to simplify to: is it AoE? Then use AoE button. If not, do you have Fury? No? Use the Fury generator. Yes? Use the Fury spender. And there isn't much more to the basic fill of the rotation than that. This can be written out to an 18-step sequence to follow if you really want to, but simply obeying the balls tend to be good enough. Monk's burst sequence is mainly dictated by 2 factors: Riddle of Fire and Brotherhood, and perfect balance. Optimally, Riddle of Fire dictates when bursting occurs, and how the burst takes shape is dictated by perfect balance. Under normal circumstances, the odd minute offers 1 perfect balance and the even minute offers 2. And how you design these perfect balance bursts has an impact on how future perfect balances work, with the notable example being that whether you open with double Lunar or not can determine how your odd and even minute bursts play out for the remainder of the fight. The step 1 of the filler rotation for Monk is the strongest part, which also means that a burst should optimally start after a step 1 specifically, or at least planned around this fact. This detail makes Monk rather specific about how much skill speed they want, as making the rotation play out in a specific way can make the rotation both slightly easier to maneuver, but also get more damage out of it. The fact that step 1 combos are the most important part also features as significant because every masterful blitz that follows after perfect balance gives you free reign to choose whichever step you want next. Oppo form please, and Fire's reply, also granting this, further emphasizes this detail. In terms of optimization, Monk has much less prep than most other jobs, giving the freedom to choose an opener that matches better with its team composition and preference. This is both relevant to make the most of the Monk's own damage, but also so Brotherhood is as useful as possible. Furthermore, whether double Lunar, or a different opener at all, is optimal can depend on the expected length of a fight, which means some level optimization can involve looking quite far ahead. However, the most important part is making the most of every Riddle of Fire burst window alongside perfect balance. Defensively, the Monk has, like all melees, Bloodbath, Feint, Leg Sweep, Arm's Length, and Second Wind. On top of this, Monk has Thunderclap, giving it great mobility in a fight. Riddle of Earth also works as a strong defensive cooldown, and it comes with an AoE heal on top, although the area of that heal is very small. A huge selling point for Monks is that thanks to the Fury gauge, the job can sometimes be considered to almost play itself, as long as you keep an eye on Riddle of Fire, making Monk one of the better options if you want to be able to focus on the fight. Next up is the Samurai, also of the striking category. With the aesthetic and gameplay of a disciplined samurai fighting style, possibly not unlikely to take inspiration from Kendo, combined with the fantasy samurai's combination of instantaneous single slashes of death and hundreds of slashes in a fraction of a second, the samurai is, perhaps, very much in tune with what you would expect of the job. The basic rotation of the samurai involves maintaining Higanbana while cycling through 3 different combo sequences, both to maintain a damage and speed buff, but also to build up to their Midare Setsugeka Iai Jutsu. Even at a more basic level of rotation, the samurai can optimize the use of the Higanbana Iai Jutsu by optimizing where they are in their rotation when it needs to be reapplied. This is further amplified by planning when to use the Kaishi Setsugeka follow-ups from Midare Setsugeka for where it makes the most sense. as Samurai inherently does not have any temporary damage buffs of its own, the basics of the job involve making the most of the cooldowns it has when they come up, with the most complex being Make Your Shisui, where as long as three-step combo finishes are used in it, maximum value is attained. Optimizing Samurai turns the rotation into a much more strict and rigid system, alternating between bursting and filler sequences, changing the rotation from using whatever you have when you have it, to bursting what you do have every minute, and then performing a filler rotation for the remainder of the minute, which tends to involve building up to 2 Midare Setsugekas, but only spending 1, and not even spending the Kaishi Setsugeka follow-up to save it for the burst. This both simplifies the Samurai rotation, as it is rather specific, but also makes it vulnerable to downtime, as there is rarely ever extra GCDs you can spare. The main motivation of the Samurai to perform its burst every minute is, for the even minute, to make sure their biggest damage occurs while other jobs are offering damage boosting raid buffs. On the odd minute, it is often a lot more about most efficiently using the cooldowns you do have and reapplying Higanbana on time, so that everything continues to align for the even minute. This kind of structure can make Samurai feel very different depending on whether you play it more off the cuff or actually optimized. Due to the strictness of the Samurai rotation, it, similar to Monk, also has interest in having a specific amount of speed. An unfortunate problem there, however, is that it can be difficult to find a speed that works for both of them. Defensively, Samurai have both a gap closer and a gap widener with Gyoten and Yaten. Aside from that, Tengetsu makes Samurai one of the tankier melee jobs with a defensive cooldown that has a very short cooldown, also a surprisingly long duration, and a healing attached. Tengetsu, on top of that, also grants the Samurai Kenki to use to do more damage, motivating the Samurai to use this tool more often for offensive reasons. Probably the biggest selling point for Samurai is that it has one of the most concentrated bursts in the game, with options like Tendo Setsugeka Kaishi alongside Senye, Sanjin, and Showa. It having this on top of offering no raid buffs of its own also makes Samurai one of those jobs that really benefit from other jobs supporting it. Speaking of supporting, next up, let's drag out the Dragoon, the first of the maiming category. Quite a Final Fantasy classic, complete with a bunch of jumps and dragon stuff. The maiming category of melees wear equipment with slightly more physical defense than the rest, allowing them to take slightly more physical punishment than the other categories. A very unique aspect of Dragoon is that unlike the other melees, it has 5-step filler combos instead of 3, which, due to the length of them, almost meld together for a single 10-step filler combo. Aside from Life Surge and Wormwind Thrust, pretty much all of the Dragoon's cooldowns can be dealt with entirely separately from the filler combo, which sort of produces a rotation where you handle 2 separate systems as a combined unit. While other jobs also have this feature, several of Dragoon's cooldowns unfurl into more attack buttons, almost like some sort of lunchbox. This makes a core part of the rotation about using the real, actual cooldowns first, and then working your way through the various side dishes, or ready buffs, that can be used almost whenever. Because Dragoon has not 1, not 2, but 3 separate temporary damage buffs, one of which is a raid buff, it relies quite heavily on these cooldowns being used right to do well. This means that optimizing Dragoon is a lot about making sure Battle Litany comes out on time, alongside Lance Charge and Geistgakul. After that, performing the filler combo consistently while making your way through the various cooldowns is the largest part of the job. Sometimes, holding Wormwind Thrust, if it will line up nicely with raid buffs, can be another optimization strategy. And beyond that, it sort of boils down to making the most of Life Surge, which can sometimes get complicated with how your filler combo lines up with raid buffs, and how the cooldown of Life Surge lines up as well. Sometimes, the weaker GCD options can be worth spending it on if there are enough buffs after all. Due to how many OGCD options Dragoon gets from its lunchboxes, it can also get a lot more hectic than the other melee jobs. A very niche final optimization Dragoons can do is Mirage Dive smuggling. By intentionally drifting jump a bit, it can be possible to fit both the Mirage Dive as well as another jump and Mirage Dive inside bursts due to the 15-second duration on Mirage Dive and 30-second cooldown on jump. Defensively, Dragoon has a few mobility options, notably Winged Glide, Dragonfire Dive and Stardiver, alongside the Gap Widener in Elusive Jump. The Dragoon really has nothing else defensively aside from its slightly sturdier armor. The biggest selling point of Dragoon is likely the intensity of the rotation during bursts. The fact that it has sort of two separate rotations can also be exciting for some players, as it means it can have a rotation that somewhat relies on where you are in your GCD rotation without it totally wrecking your OGCD rotation as a result, which, while perhaps a slight exaggeration, can happen for Monk and Samurai. Let's jump on to Reaper next, the other of the maiming category. Wielding a scythe and dark magic alongside teaming up with a void scent makes it the perfect edgy job in the game. The basic rotation of the Reaper is sort of a priority system, where Death's Design sits at the top, followed by making the most of the various cooldowns, and finishing at the very bottom of the list with 1-2-3 combos. The job works by generating two different resources, the first generated quickly from various attacks, Soul Gauge, the other, Shroud Gauge, generated specifically through attacks that spend Soul Gauge. This allows the job to have a builder-spender rotation, where it simultaneously builds and spends as its filler, and builds in its filler and spends in its burst. Reaper's filler rotation is one of the slowest rotations in the game, with hardly any OGCDs at all. However, the burst, signified by Enshroud itself, is one of the faster rotations, making Reaper, similar to Machinist, one of the jobs that can be extremely problematic to play if you have less than a stellar connection. In broad strokes, Reapers build up to Enshrouds and spend Enshrouds around 3 times in a 2-minute window, slightly less, with one of them granted by Plentiful Harvest, which itself is granted by Reaper's 2-minute raid buff Arcane Circle. However, when it comes to optimizing Reaper, 2 of those Enshrouds are typically used in quick succession during the 2-minute burst, which is done by wasting time in Enshroud. Enshroud's cooldown is nearly twice as long as it takes to spend it. However, Shadow of Death is usable during it, so entering Enshroud and then beating around the bush with Shadow of Death can allow a Reaper to chain them together once the burst begins proper. This does of course leave around 1 Enshroud extra in the 2-minute time frame, and this can often be used wherever it makes sense. Other optimizations Reaper can do involve the timing of Gluttony, although the double Enshrouds tend to take priority over it. As a result of how insanely long the 2-minute burst is in raw GCDs, Reapers also sometimes have to think about returning to their 1-2-3 combo so as to not let it drop by time. And finally, Soul Sow and Harvest Moon represent one of the greater single attacks in the toolkit, but you sort of only get one per fight. So optimization of Reaper also involves knowing whether you will need an AoE ranged attack anywhere in the fight, or if you can just throw it. As both Harp and Harvest Moon generate Soul Gauge, Reaper somewhat uniquely also has the capacity to generate resources while out of melee range among the melee DPS jobs. Defensively, Reaper has Hell's Ingress and Egress as well as Regress, letting it hop where it needs to and return when it is safe again. Reaper also has Arcane Crest, which not only is a very short cooldown barrier, but offers healing for the raid as a whole if it is popped by damage, enabling the Reaper to offer a reasonable amount of raid healing regularly. A rather funny selling point of Reaper, aside from the edgy style of it, is that it has very few positionals, with all of them being concentrated in Gibbet and Gallows and nothing else, meaning that if you would like to play a melee DPS but you don't like positionals, Reaper might just be the right choice for you. Next, dashing out of the shadows, we have Ninja, the first of the Scouting category. Scouting jobs uniquely use dexterity instead of strength, meaning that while the striking and maiming categories can share accessories, Scouting jobs instead share accessories with ranged DPS jobs. Ninja specifically comes with exactly what you'd probably expect: Mudra hand signs, summoning frogs, shadow clones, the works. Ninja's rotation is almost completely concentrated on the minute burst, with stockpiling cooldowns and resources to burst whenever Kunai's Bane or Trick Attack is available to make the most of it. This means that outside of bursts, Ninja typically will only use a single Suiton or Huton, and perhaps Bunshin and maybe Phantom Kamaitachi, making everything else outside of bursts simply 1-2-3 combos, stockpiling Kazumatoi with Armor Crush and spinning them with Aeolian Edge. The bursts then involve 3 Mudras, 10 Jijin, and 3 Raijus at peak, although slightly less than this for the odd bursts, possibly leaving space for filler GCD, but probably not. Ninja also offers an indirect raid buff with Dokomori, which increases the damage the enemy takes rather than boosting the damage done by the party. This can be mildly significant because in an alliance raid context, Dokomori will be beneficial for all of the parties. Because of how burst-centric Ninja is, performing an optimal burst is often a basic requirement to do decently well with the job, which means that the optimization itself often boils down to using the right burst for the job. Sometimes, a fight simply doesn't allow the ninja to stand still for a couple of seconds for Tenjin at the exact time they want to. Sometimes a slightly different burst just happens to be more beneficial. Considerations like bringing Phantom Kamaitachi into a burst somehow when it is offbeat can also sometimes be beneficial. Phantom smuggling? Another optimization angle for ninjas involve their mudras. While ninja has throwing daggers as a filler when they can't be in range, Raiton is stronger than throwing dagger, and using Raiton and then Raiju outside of buffs is almost certainly always superior to using throwing dagger at all, even if it comes at cost to the burst. Aside from this, due to how insanely burst-centric Ninja is, dealing with situations where things get misaligned can be a huge part of its optimization too, which, in a strange way, could also apply to Dragoon. Defensively, Ninja has Shokuchi to move freely to a location in a large range, making it the most flexible on mobility of all the melee jobs. It also has Shadeshift, which is a slightly bigger shield than Reaper's Arcane Crest, but it is on a much longer cooldown. Notably, ninjas also simply run 10% faster than all other jobs by default. This does not stack with other speed bonuses, just like is the case with all speed bonuses. It is always the biggest one that applies and nothing else. But it does mean ninjas can move into positions slightly faster than other jobs by default. A huge selling point of Ninja is its strong feel match with the design, that for mudras you have to actually memorize and perform the right sequence of signs, which many likely resonate with. Another big selling point is that the complete laser focus on the burst itself means that ninjas can have a very relaxed rotation outside of bursts, focusing on other things, and only really need to worry about their rotation in great detail during the burst, which, granted, is about a third of the time, but still. And finally, Viper slithers in at the end of the list. The other scouting category job, using a pair of swords that combine for a twin blade or clave. It combines a handful of interesting features from other jobs together to make what many would consider the simplest DPS job in the game once you learn it. Let's dig in. Viper's basic rotation involves maintaining their damage buff and their speed buff, both of which can be maintained once a single loop of the 1-2-3 combo has been performed by simply pressing the glowy button, similarly to Monk. Vicewinder offers an alternative combo sequence that can be performed in two different orders depending on which buff you want to reapply first or which positional you want to do first. This alternative combo is of course also stronger and also generates a Rattling Coil, which is spent on Uncoiled Fury, a ranged attack that is actually stronger, which means Vipers regularly will be using ranged attacks as part of their rotation, without it being a core part of their burst, allowing the Viper to use them whenever it happens to be convenient. The Vicewinder combo and Uncoiled Fury, also uniquely among so-called continuation combo style attacks, have two follow-ups that need to be done in a specific order for maximum damage, even if you can do them in either order. Finishing regular 1-2-3 combos also lead to a single continuation follow-up. Both performing the coils from Vicewinder and finishing 1-2-3 combos generate a resource used for the burst started with Reawaken, and usually, Viper will generate enough for 2 of these in 2 minutes, with Serpent's Ire offering an extra one every 2 minutes, alongside an extra Rattling Coil. This burst also includes several follow-up OGCD attacks and features the option of doing the attacks in any order, but a specific, but incredibly obvious, order being the one you get rewarded for. This kind of burst is very similar to Reaper's burst, but as Viper does not have a temporary cooldown of its own, Viper has the freedom to burst whenever it wants to, making it exceptionally flexible in less optimized groups. Optimizing Viper boils down to getting the opener right, making the most of every Rattling Coil, and using as many Reawaken bursts as possible, with about 2 of them every other minute landing in raid buffs to the best of your ability. Serpent's Ire can even be used as your egg watch to keep track of when everyone else's raid buffs come up. Defensively, the only thing Viper has is Slither, allowing it to move around just like Monk can with Thunderclap. That is genuinely it. The biggest selling point of Viper is probably its flashiness and its simplicity. If you want to play a melee DPS but don't like the complexity of the other melees, where either it matters a lot where you are in your combo when the burst starts, or the burst itself is really complicated, Viper has a dedicated burst button. On top of that, Viper is definitely the best among the 6 at dealing with being forced out of melee range thanks to Uncoiled Fury. A big downside of Viper, however, is that its many mandatory OGCD weaves and relatively fast rotation makes it an incredibly bad match if you don't have a solid latency. To round up this comparison, of course, every melee DPS brings something unique to the table. Viper and Samurai are very different approaches to the selfish DPS, with Samurai being able to capitalize harder on optimal burst setups, and Viper having a much easier time aligning to whatever happens. Ninja and Dragoon both offer very strict and high-paced burst rotations out of the box, making it pretty clear when things aren't being done right. And Monk and Reaper also offer raid buffs and have burst windows, but have enough big damage buttons and flexibility that you can sort of make it work in a more free style. For a new player wanting to start as a melee DPS, I recommend Monk, as it has a reasonably high pace rotation, with regularly occurring positionals and burst windows being introduced at higher levels, making the knowledge you acquire from playing Monk applicable for understanding the basics of all the other melee jobs. For someone that would prefer a slower paced start, Dragoon is also a good choice. However, as mentioned, Dragoon gets a bit crazy at higher levels. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, before Dawntrail, Monk's filler rotation ran exactly like it does now. However, it was instead dictated by Dragon Kick grinding a buff not unlike the Fury effect it gives now, Twin Snakes maintaining a universal damage buff, and Demolish maintaining a dot on the target. This is sort of the reason why it is even remotely relevant that the rotation naturally produces an 18-step loop.